you where to find liquid, but can't always tell you whether it's oil or water. Until somebody invents a pair of eyes that can see under the ground, drilling for oil will always be a Las Vegas-sized gamble. But that's another thing I like about this business. It's sink or swim. Make it big or not at all. You have to have the stomach for it, or you won't survive. For some reason, that works for me. I stood on a raised metal grating, coiling up the heavy chains they used to set drill pipe. Even with noise protectors on my ears, the decibel level of the diesel engines was shouting loud. It didn't seem to bother the roughnecks, though. They communicated with hand signals when they had to. Some of the signals were easy to figure, like a circle to rev it up, and some weren't, but the roughnecks knew them all. They had to. Their lives depended on it. I looked up and saw a helicopter settling onto a landing pad above my head, its high-pitched engines screaming like trumpets, introducing the boss himself. The chopper's skids hadn't hardly touched down when out stepped Jack Patterson, better known as Spin, the 38-year-old CEO of Gulf Tex Oil. With him was Joe Wright, his chief engineer, and Bud Hightower, the 65-year-old founder of Gulf Tex, who was chairman of the company and its biggest shareholder. He also happened to be Spin's father-in-law, considering Spin had married Audrey Hightower when they graduated from college. Mr. Hightower was lean and tall, with a gray buzz cut and weathered skin and a cigarette that never fell out of his mouth. If he'd had a cowboy hat on, he would have been the Marlboro Man. Joe Wright, the chief engineer, wore glasses and a baggy jumpsuit, a bit of a geek, but smart as a fox. Spin was another story. He was rich, powerful, and good-looking, the kind of big dog all the other dogs wanted to run with. He had on this dark suit and a silver hard hat with the Gulf Tex logo on it, but underneath the glitz, he was a regular guy who was comfortable shooting the breeze with the roughnecks and getting a feel for what was really going on. According to Dad, Spin's biggest problem is trimming the company's fat by getting rid of old rigs, obsolete machinery, and things they don't need. Even though Spin was young and married to the boss's daughter, everybody respected him because he'd come up the hard way. First he was a roughneck, then a wildcatter, then he was head of a drilling service company in Corpus. Dad said he'd taken over Gulf Tex when it was about to go bankrupt, and in only 3 years turned it around. Will said he was a man with vision, who understood that the only way to find oil was with modern technology. Apparently that's why he'd hired Joe Wright, this genius engineer from the University of Texas. Spin led the way down the metal steps to the landing where I was standing. When his helicopter shut down the engines, I lifted off my ear protectors and waited for him to come by. The minute he saw me, he smiled and stuck out his hand. "Hey, Max, what brings you out here?" he shouted. "It's June, Mr. Patterson. School's out," I yelled. "It's my chance to be a roughneck." He pulled the strap under my hard hat and hit the top. "Keep that thing on tight, okay?" He started to leave, then stopped and looked at me. "You know what?" he said after thinking it over. "Why don't you climb up to the crane cab and watch from up there? You'll get a view of everything, and Puck can explain what's going on." He lifted his walkie-talkie, hit the transmit button, and told the crane operator, Puck Tarver, I was coming up. I don't think Puck liked the idea at first, because Spin turned away to talk to him in private, but after that, he smiled at me and pointed at the steel ladder leading 6 stories up to the control cab. I waved at him, grabbed my ear protectors, and went for the ladder while Spin and Mr. Hightower walked down the metal steps to the main deck. By the time I'd reached the cab, it felt like I'd climbed up a circus ladder to a high-wire platform. I opened the door, entered, and sat in the chair behind Puck, who got his nickname because he'd played semi-pro hockey. He was wearing a hard hat, earphones with a microphone curled in front of his mouth, and dark sunglasses, and he was busy raising a heavy, new Caterpillar diesel engine from a seagoing barge up to the main deck of the platform. I watched him operate the crane controls, the joysticks, foot pedals, and buttons, while he talked to the guys on the deck below. I was curious about which levers took the crane hook in which direction, but I didn't interrupt to ask. There was an extra headset on the control panel, so I picked it up and put it over my head and listened as Puck and a roughneck, guiding the payload into position, talked to each other. I recognized the other voice instantly. It was my brother Will's. I looked down and saw him standing next to an empty mud pit, a shallow well on the deck where they were going to store the engine, waiting for the crane to bring the engine to him. Looking at the other side of the deck, I saw Spin, Joe, and Mr. Hightower greet my dad with handshakes and shouts over the noise. Then I saw Spin and Mr. Hightower walk to the railing on the far side of the platform and look down at a fuel boat delivery hose that was being lifted by a small crane. When it got up to the deck, a couple of roughnecks with goggles and gloves grabbed it and guided its nozzle into a metal coupling, and a few minutes later, the hose swelled up with diesel fuel that was being pumped into a huge tank on the deck. Diesel oil's critical on a drilling platform because it runs all the engines, generators, and pumps you need to produce a field. It seemed kind of ironic to me, all that oil being burned to find more oil. Back on the near side of the platform, the Caterpillar engine dangled a few feet above the deck. Puck talked into his mic, didn't get an answer from Will, asked Will if he could hear him, then repeated himself, but still got no answer. He tapped the mic with his finger, cussed when it didn't work, and pulled a plastic pill case out of his breast pocket. He opened it and fished out a couple of white pills and said, "Excedrin," to me, holding 3 in his hand. When I shook my head no, he put the case back into his pocket and held onto the pills. I could hear him talking into the mic, but I heard no answer in my headset from Will or anyone else on the deck. Evidently, the intercom was busted. How they could put a man on the moon but couldn't get an intercom to work was a mystery to me, but it happened all the time. I saw Puck change channels from number 2 to number 3 on his headset and say, "My reception's out, Spin. Can't hear Will on channel 2 and I can't hear you on channel 3. Can you hear me? If you can, give me a hand signal." I saw Spin wave to Puck, saying yes, he could hear. Puck cupped his hand around his mic and talked into it so he didn't have to yell at Spin over the cab noise. I couldn't hear what he said, but apparently he and Spin got their hand signals worked out. Puck popped the 3 Excedrin pills into his mouth, chewed them up without water, and worked the joystick. A second later, the Caterpillar engine began moving across the deck toward the mud pit. That's when it happened. Puck looked over at me with his mouth open in surprise. "What's wrong?" I said. His face turned red like he was doing sit-ups. His hands rose to his throat, and he pitched forward against the glass window, knocking his hard hat to the floor. "Puck!" I got out of my chair and leaned over him. His cheek was pushed up against the glass, his eyes were half open, and his skin was sweaty. I looked down and saw the diesel engine swinging across the deck a few feet above the surface. I hit the transmit button on my mic. "Puck's passed out," I yelled. Channel 2. "Will?" No answer. Channel 3. "Can anybody hear me down there? Puck's passed out." I tried talking on all channels, but nobody answered. As I found out later, they could hear me, but I couldn't hear them. Will and the Roughnecks looked up at me. I pointed at Puck, collapsed against the window, yelled into my mic again, "Puck's out!" and threw my hands high into the air. What should I do? The 2-ton diesel engine was approaching the mud pit, but when the Roughnecks raised their hands to stop it, its weight was too much, and it sailed by. They looked up at me. "What's happening up there?" I looked at the control panel. The joystick had arrows pointing in 4 directions, north, east, south, and west, but I couldn't tell what they meant when it came to understanding the direction of the swinging payload. I started talking to myself. If I push it forward, which way will it go? I could see an arrow pointing forward, but I didn't know if that meant up or down. Same for right and left. Fucking dyslexia. When I played quarterback, my center had to touch his right or left knee just to make sure I knew which way the play was going. I wiped away the sweat dripping off the end of my nose and looked down at the deck. Everything was happening fast. The diesel engine was headed for the edge of the platform. Will was drawing his hand across his neck, telling me to cut the engine. I looked for the ignition switch but couldn't find it. The payload kept moving. It was headed right at Mr. Hightower, who was leaning over the railing looking down at the fuel boat. I saw men cup their hands at their mouths and yell at him. I grabbed the joystick and pushed it to the side, hoping for the best,